So welcome all to this joint webinar with EWORA. And I think that I have known you, Gulsen, since this organization started, actually. But this webinar on the gender equality on higher education and research is in the celebration of the International Women's Day, which we all know is the 8th. And I will come back to this. And gender equality of today for sustainable tomorrow is the theme for the International Women's Day. And in this, in accordance with this, I would like to highlight that higher education is providing knowledge and competence to all sectors of societies. And therefore, it's very crucial that higher education recognize the gender equality in all what they are doing, because we are also sending out students and knowledge to the society at all. And if we don't bring up the gender perspective, we will not see that in society at large, and we will not reach a sustainable future. It's half of the population in all countries that we are talking about. So it is very, very important to talk about gender equality in higher education. Just shortly about IAU, it was started 70 years back, and it's the global association of university and higher education institutions and organizations, and that's all around the world. That is important because we are also the global voice for higher education. We do cooperate with partners on national and international organizations, but also intergovernmental organizations. And in particular, I will mention UNESCO. We are, from the beginning, we were actually inaugurated by UNESCO, and we are still official partner of UNESCO. The prioritized areas of IAU is leadership, internationalization, higher education for sustainable development, and technology. And I would say that all these prioritized areas are crucial also when we discuss gender perspectives. And as we all know, sitting here, the leadership is very, very important. And fortunately, I'm coming from a country with among 50% of the leadership in the universities are women. In the sustainable development areas, IAU is through a cluster of higher education for sustainable development. We had Bologna University being the leader of the SDG 5. And with them and with all the other members and partners, we have several publications, and we have organized webinars, and you can find this all on the webpage from IAU. And please take a look at that because it's free. You can look into most publications. Now our IAU has recognized, and not at least we have recognized during the COVID situation, maybe the backlash for women in leadership in university after the COVID, because they dropped out of research and so on. But IAU wants now to scale up the gender equality in higher education on the global level. And therefore, we are very, very pleased that we could partner with EWORA, with a long experience in this area, in the development of the gender equality perspectives in higher educations. So we have another joint webinar just a few days from now, the 8th, at the International Women's Day. And that will be a joint webinar together with EWORA, but also together with the Education Sub-Saharan African organization. And I really want you to visit that webinar, and also that we can bring on just that day the perspective of gender equality in higher education. So I'm sorry I can't listen to you, but I think that Hilish will bring back what has been coming up, and I wish you a very good webinar. So thank you and good luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your short but very informative presentation or opening speech. I wish in the next one we will be together. Okay.
Yes.
So, okay, thank you. So now it's my turn. Dear colleagues, it is very interesting that we have had nearly 50 registration, but unfortunately we have less than 20 participants at the moment. But we have very valuable participants in our webinar. Thank you for joining us. Dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to celebrate International Day, International Women Day 2022 in advance, and welcome you to this webinar titled Gender Equality in Higher Education and Research Across Europe. We are celebrating the 8th March, but on the other hand, there is a very sad invasion going on Ukraine, where not only the country and its people are under great threat, but also the peace all over the world under these chaotic conditions. But we should not be pessimistic. There is always hope to create a better world for all of us. Dear colleagues, it has been a great opportunity for EWORA to organize 2 consecutive webinars for celebrating International Women's Day 2022, together with International Association of Presidents. Pam Friedman, President of IAU, and myself will be chairing this webinar together. Unfortunately, now she has another involvement. She has to leave. The next IAU and EWORA and ESSA webinar has been organized on 8th of March, and you are all invited to join us in the next one as well. After living 2 years with this unexpected pandemic COVID-19 across the world, we do hope that it will fade away by this summer. The question is, shall we go back to our normal practice as if nothing happened? Or will there be a lot of changes in our lives, in our higher education and research activities? It's for sure that many things have already changed in our life patterns, our thoughts, our way of thinking and acting, our way of teaching and learning, doing research and communicating with our colleagues and students. We have had difficult times, but also we have gained a lot of experience and have been able to look at our environment from different point of view. And also we are ready to make changes in all above mentioned areas. Maybe one of the most important awareness that we have gained in this period is we are in the same boat called Earth. After all, saving our boat and making it sustainable for our further generations has become the #1 goal on our agenda. Although there has been a lot of effort by many international organizations, mainly led by United Nations, UNESCO, and European Commission, the impact of the measures taken by them and nation states have not been successful at the level that we were expecting. One important point that I would like to draw your attention is that we women are more sensitive than our male counterparts to play a major role for saving and securing our planet and our future generations on our beautiful Earth. There are good practices observed as very successful responses of women political leaders to pandemic who have been also widely appreciated all around the world. On the other hand, women academics have been negatively affected more than their male counterparts under the pandemic conditions. If women would like to create a better world, then they should be having at least equal representation with their male colleagues in all decision-making processes. That is why European Commission gives priority to increasing the women in higher education and research area of European Union at top positions and creating new incentives and opportunities for establishing support mechanisms to achieve the goal, such as implementing gender equality plans as a requirement for research funding applications for European Commission. Dear colleagues, I would like to celebrate once again International Women's Day 2022 with the dream of having equal representation between women and men at every segment of life. Before I conclude my introduction, I would like to share two quotations. First one is a joint message disseminated on 9th of February 2022 by Ms. Sima Bahos, Executive Director of UN Women, and Ms. Audrey Azoulay, Director General of UNESCO. Here is the quotation. Now it's time to recognize women's contributions in research and innovation, smash stereotypes, and defeat discrimination against women and girls in science. Second quotation is indicated by UN as this year's 8 March theme. Let us work together for achieving gender equality today for sustainable tomorrow. Now let me introduce our distinguished keynote speaker and our eminent discussants. Today, we are very lucky to have Mrs. Mina Stareva, Head of the Gender Equality Sector in DG Research and Innovation, European Commission, as our keynote speaker. We have two eminent discussants who are also members of EWORA Scientific Advisory Board and who are always with us. I would like to thank both of them for accepting to be discussant in this very important webinar. Professor Aileen Drew, Director, Trinity Center for Gender Equality and Leadership, Trinity College Dublin. Professor Fanny Chehung, former Pro-Vice Chancellor, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. My last words are devoted to the two Secretary Generals of IAU and EWORA, who contributed a lot to the organization of these webinars. I would like to thank Hülya Çağlayan, Secretary General of EWORA, Hilji Van Lent, Secretary General of IAU, for their precious contributions to organize our joint webinars together. Now we are going to have to listen our keynote speaker, Mina. Mina, floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. It was a very inspirational introduction. So I'm, of course, very pleased to be here with you to share this moment, even though, of course, I would have preferred that this webinar take part under much different circumstances, of course. But we are here also to celebrate and to acknowledge the fantastic role of women researchers and women top leaders towards gender equality, but also to somehow recognize the barriers and the responsibility of each of us ahead of the 8th of March, the International Women's Day. What I wanted to share with you today, of course, I would like to start by a few figures. Those few figures are presented under our latest edition of She Figures 2021, which was published last year, which somehow provides an overview on the reality on the ground. And of course, who I am to speak about the reality of the ground, you are the one who experience in your daily life. But I would like to be that we are all on the same ground when we discuss actually gender equality in research and innovations. These figures are presented for the EU 27 member states, but they represent a global trend. So when we look into these snapshots of data, of course, starting with the good news, one could see that we have almost reached gender parity at PhD level in all fields considered. Of course, the situation is much different when it comes to the information and communication technologies. Going up to the career ladder, so all disciplines considered, only a third of researchers in the EU are women. Numbers are even more striking when it comes to the science, technology, and engineering and mathematics fields. If I need to continue, women occupy just 26% of top academic positions overall, and only 18 in the field of engineering and technology. And among heads of higher education institutions, the gap is still huge, with women holding less than 24% of these positions. And again, these are general universal trends. If we go to the next slide, I would like to say that the She Figures edition of last year also presented some policy briefs addressing new and emerging, or on the contrary, persisting challenges towards gender equality in higher education and research. And She Figures also paid specific attention to the issue of women in leadership and in decision-making positions. We know it, I mean, you know it, we know it, access to the highest levels, such as university presidents, rectors, deans, but also department or laboratory chairs, is hampered by different barriers linked to work-life balance conditions, lack of recognition, lack of encouragement. And this is why we have really decided to focus on this last year and to develop a policy brief with some concrete recommendations to empower women to take up these roles. And of course, recommendations include support schemes such as mentoring, job sharing, requesting gender balance search committees, for instance, setting quotas, unconscious gender bias trainings, and also very importantly, connection with professional organizations such as EWORA, for instance. And this is something that we very much encourage in our funding opportunities for research organizations. And of course, we started by this, needless to say, women's research and innovation careers have been and are still disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. It is something that we are very much committed to address further. We are launching an expert group on this as of next week. If you look to the next slide, I would like just to present you very briefly the policy context, because gender equality has been an explicit priority in the European research area since 2012, building on three underpinning objectives, which are gender equality at all career levels, gender balance in decision making, and very importantly also the integration of gender dimension in teaching content and also in research and innovation content. And we do actually foster what we call an institutional change, a transformation at the organizational level through the implementation of gender equality plans. And still, despite the many projects that we have funded, and despite the existing strategies at national level, women remain underrepresented at top academic positions and in decision-making positions. So, and we know it, you know it very well, that women leaders in higher education, such you are actually here, can be actually very important ambassadors and actors of change in terms of achieving better gender equality at the institutional level. And this we see it often, and we see it also at the organizational level, such as the European Commission, where you have a top leadership committed to gender equality, and we actually come with much more ambitious agenda for gender equality, such as in the field of research and innovation under now the leadership of Commissioner Maria Gabriel. So within the European research area context, we work together with member states, universities, research organizations, funders, and researchers to develop and implement inclusive gender equality plans and to open up our policy to intersections with grounds for discrimination such as disability, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, age, etc. This is new at the European Commission level, and we are very much committed to advance on this and to actually collect a good overview of the different practices across countries and across organizations. We have currently committed a study on this, and we will have the first results in April, which I will be very happy to share also with you. Many of your organizations actually have contributed to our mapping exercise. And also very importantly, with the new European research area, we actually want to ensure a full geographical inclusiveness. We want to have everyone on board, and we also want to learn from each other and to better connect also with the private sector. It's a must. We need to learn from each other. If you go to the next slide, which is very important because we all have a responsibility here, but those that are really responsible for implementing a structural change are the member states, are national authorities. They're the ones setting the agenda, research funders and member states. So what is very important is that within the European Research Area policy context, member states and associated countries are very much behind the idea of fostering institutional change through the implementation of inclusive gender equality plans. The Pact for Research and Innovation, which was adopted last year, places a very important priority to gender equality as clear European values, but also the global communication for gender equality plays for research and innovation places gender equality as one of the key values in terms of international cooperation in the field of science and technology. Member states came up with the first ever ERA policy agenda, 2022-2024, approved also last year as an annex to the Council conclusions on European Research Area. And there, gender equality is one of the 20 priorities identified for immediate action at member states level, together with the Commission and together with universities, research funders, and research organizations. This very much builds on the Ljubljana Declaration on Gender Equality, which was co-designed under the Slovenian presidency of the EU last year, together with many member states, but which fantastically has been endorsed not only by the Commission and by member states, but also by international partners. A total of 40 countries have endorsed the principles for gender equality in research and innovation. So if we go to the next slide, I would just like to present you the 4 deliverables in the ERA policy agenda, the specific action on gender equality and inclusiveness, which build on the commitment in the Ljubljana Declaration and which are intrinsically interlinked. So we looked at those deliverables together. Of course, a precondition for everything is to have a very strong and efficient policy coordination mechanism across member states, including also research organizations and universities, to actually monitor, support, monitor, develop the different aspects of the gender equality plans and inclusive gender equality policies, and to set a network, an appropriate network at EU and European, I would say also at global level for their implementation. A very important aspect that comes relatively new on the EU agenda in research and innovation, but it's an old phenomenon, is the need to counteract gender-based violence and sexual harassment, which occurs unfortunately also in the academic circles. So we are very much committed to address and to come with some sort of a code of conduct on how to prevent and address gender-based violence in academia and in research. We also want to develop a policy approach to strengthen gender equality across all other research and innovation, higher education and research priorities, because gender equality should not be dealt in isolation. On the contrary, it should be really linked to all the priorities for researchers, higher education, research assessment, etc. And last but not least, we want to work with research funding organizations to develop principles for the integration and the evaluation of the gender perspective in research and innovation content. Having said that, if we go to the next slide, of course, the most important tool for the implementation of this political commitment is Horizon Europe. So we can go to the next slide. With Horizon Europe, which is our framework program for research and innovation until 2027, we actually strengthen our commitment. And as we often say, we change gears, because gender equality is a cross-cutting commitment across the whole program, but we come with some important novelties. And one of them is that we come with a new eligibility criteria. I will spend 2 slides on this because this is very important for the purposes of the webinar today. We also make the integration of gender dimension in all research and innovation action mandatory. It is a matter of social responsibility. We will not fund research or innovation that does not address the impact, the potential impact of the action on men or women, boys or girls, or groups of women and men differently. So for us, this is a must, unless, of course, in a very specific fields where one could say differently. And of course, gender balance in research projects is also an executive proposal. It's a ranking criteria for proposals with the same score. So I would like to focus a little bit, if you go to the next slide, I would like to focus a little bit and the next slide on the gender equality plans as an eligibility criteria, where as of 2022, so as of this year, public bodies, research organizations, and higher education institutions from European member states and associated countries to Horizon Europe must have in place a gender equality plan in order to receive funding from Horizon Europe. So those plans, if we go to the next slide, must fulfill 4 mandatory criteria, and these are basic. We would all agree that this is really the minimum that a gender equality plan should have. So a plan has to be public and has to be endorsed by the top management. There is a need of dedicated resources and expertise. Data collection, sex and gender disaggregated data collection and monitoring are of course key. And as well as training and awareness raising on unconscious bias, for instance, to staff and management are also important. To go to the next slide, it is very important to say that, of course, such a gender equality plan should be tailored to each organization's mission, history, and content. But still, we think that there are some important thematic areas that must be covered by a gender equality plan. These are not mandatory. So a gender equality plan that does not address all of those areas will be still eligible, but we consider that this should be we strongly recommend for these areas to be addressed in a gender equality plan. And of course, as you can see, these are also related to work-life balance and organizational culture, leadership and decision-making, recruitment and career progression, integration of gender dimension, and measures against sexual harassment and gender-based violence. What I wanted to highlight here in relation to the webinar today is that increasing the number and the share of women in leadership and in decision-making position is a process that actually touches upon all aspects in the gender equality plan, from sex and gender disaggregated data collection, analysis of identifying issues, to gender-sensitive training, for instance, organizational practices, and the promotion of work-life balance. If you go to the next slide, I would like to insist on one important element, and it is that for us, it is very important that every organization across Europe and beyond, especially in associated countries to Horizon Europe, is eligible for funding, is aware of those conditions of these new eligibility criteria, and is eligible for funding. So we have spent the last year and a half of building capacity within organizations, organizing training within member states, working with the European University Alliances. So really to make sure that knowledge is spread. There are quite a lot of good practices across, developed across the different projects that we have funded. And recently we have published a guidance on the gender equality plans, which provide very useful tips and practices across each of the gender equality plans building blocks. And I'm very happy to acknowledge actually that many of your organizations are part of those good practices listed in the guidance on gender equality plans. Of course, also as part of the projects that we have funded under Horizon 2020. And my last slide would be dedicated to something that is completely new, that not only we want to support organizations to actually be eligible for funding and participate, but we also want to award those that are actually leading the game, those that are providing the best practice example, those that can actually serve as mentor to the other organization and really be there to showcase commitment and a sustainable commitment, I would say. And this is why we have actually prepared a new award for gender equality champions, which will be published in April this year. So the idea of this award for gender equality champions will be actually to reward academic or research organizations in 2 different categories: organizations that have demonstrated the most progress in the implementation of their gender equality plan and its achieved results, or organizations that have developed the most innovative inclusive gender equality plan, addressing intersections with other social categories such as ethnicity, social origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. So this is something new. We will publish it later on this year. I think we are ready to publish it in April with a closing date in September. All our partner institutions and organizations will be, of course, informed in due time. And I would really encourage your organizations to apply for this Champions, Gender Equality Champions Award. I think it's a positive message to stop here. And I would be very happy, of course, to discuss further with you any of your feedback or questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mina, for this very informative presentation. I like the prize, Horizon Europe prizes, really. Do you think that they will be in the future a kind of Athena Swan type of recognition? Do you think that European Commission will create such an instrument to, encourage institutions to develop further steps towards gender equality? What's your opinion?
We are learning from the best. So currently, actually, we do have a project in place who examines the different certifications or awards in Europe, but also globally, so that we see which would be the best model adapted to the European scheme. So with this award, I think that this is an important step forward. It's the first step, and our intention is to enrich it, building on the outcomes of the research of the project in place of Casper, but also learning from you. So we are really open to your feedback, and with Gülsün, we are very, very committed to reward those organizations that are walking the talk.
Okay, thank you so much. So you are now in the hand of our discussants. So, Aileen, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can I share my screen? It might or might not work.
Well,
I guess you can.
Wrong one. Soon find out.
Yeah,
this should be.
If you can give it a try.
Okay. Can you see anything there?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. I think I have to be able to share it. Otherwise, it is just 4 slides. So it would be easy for you, Yulia, to run them as you did for Mina. What do you think?
If you think it is not working, of course I can share. I mean, in fact, I give the, I let the participants to share their screens. But if not working,
screen. Maybe this will work. Sure.
Yes, it worked.
Okay. Oh, I just want to put it in presentation mode. So, is that in presentation mode now?
We can see, yeah.
Yes, good. Okay. I want to thank Mina Starova, not for the first time, but because there's been a sort of shared history with the Commission's work and the prioritizing of gender equality, for which we remain eternally grateful. And I'm speaking from an Irish perspective, and that's how I first got to know Professor Saglamar through the FESTA project, a sister project with Project Integer and Project Genovate. That was the FP7 framework program, and that was so important. So when I speak about dissemination of Integer, GenderNet, and SAGE, I always express how vitally important it was to get the support and encouragement. And alongside that, to have access to the she figures, so that when anybody contests, but we've achieved gender equality, haven't we? We can quote those statistics and show how laboriously slow progress is and how it requires active intervention. So I'm very glad that the Commission, voiced by Mina Starova, have emphasized the importance of gender equality plans, because we started on this process from a sort of baseline 0. We've been trying in a piecemeal way in my university to make progress. And we realized there has to be a fundamental underpinning of structural change. And through the Integer project and then SAGE, we had the resources to do that. So I'm just going to outline in diagrammatic form the way in which we went about that. And again, emphasizing that structural change has to underlie all other interventions. So there has to be a bigger picture of what's happening. It has to engage all genders. The gender equality plan cannot be a woman only, and not even a women and men only, but involve all genders in the formulation and implementation. It has to also engage with all faculties, schools, disciplines, departments, and offices of the university. Because again, there is, as FESTA showed, the FESTA project, resistance can be very strong and can really impede making progress of change. The emphasis on data, I think you've spelled out so importantly, and I'll be reinforcing it. Also the acknowledgement that this takes time. And I estimate, looking in 2021 and 22, that embarking on 2011, it does take about a decade to be able to demonstrate the impact. Because in the early years, you're collecting the data, you're prioritizing, you're implementing your actions, but you may not see the follow through. So in what I'm going to speak about very briefly, I'm talking about this as a foot soldier practitioner, trying to make it work on the ground and using a diagrammatic form for the gender equality plan to help drive it and to demonstrate it. So I think just before I go to the next slide, I'll just say it's very important also, not only the time factor and delay because of resistance, but also there's no quick fix. There's not only, you know, a kind of an area of involvement that's going to pay off. And you say, well, if we just do this, the rest will follow. It doesn't really happen like that. So I would just emphasize that in going into my next slide, which was really the framework that we started with. We had in our integer project a list, the classic Excel spreadsheet list of actions and actions and actions. And what we found was, for many organizations and people working on the ground, it's very hard to take into account when that list goes to pages and pages and pages under different headings. So what we tried to do was formulate this with integer into quadrants. So you could see where the key areas are that you need to prioritize, and the actions in that outer rim of the wheel that you could then take. And there are just, you know, they are examples, but there are also actions that we took and really have borne fruit and have been very important. So emphasizing again that at the core, you have the gender disaggregated data. That is just so important, because you need that to show where the gaps are. You need that to show where the priorities are. And you need to be able to then, for impact, measuring impact, go back to where we started. Have we made progress? So we were able to, since 2011, keep on an annual basis, adding to, where charting the rate of progress. And that I think is very, very powerful, because if people don't see some payback for their efforts, they get very discouraged and say, you see, it doesn't work. We've tried it before, it doesn't work. So any excuse to get away from that. The other thing is we started with 4 quadrants, both for integer and SAGE, and now with the publication of the European Commission's 5 priority areas, we would now, for Horizon Europe, as opposed to Horizon 2020, which SAGE was a project for, we would have 5. So they wouldn't be quadrants, they would be whatever. There would be 5 sort of spokes to outline the areas, because I agree that sexual violence against women and sexual harassment are very, very important, because they represent barriers and impediments to women's advancement. So I just leave this. This will be available, and it might be useful for visualizing the kind of way forward, how your GEP, your gender equality plan would evolve, and how you then look at the actions that you can take and what the range of those would be. So there are some familiar faces there, like unconscious bias, who does the decision making, and work-life balance and the importance, particularly in a post-COVID, where are we going from what we've learned during COVID and taking work-life balance. And of course, looking at the entire culture, led from the top, but also built from the bottom up and through a team structure, which again, I think has been sought by the European Commission based on lessons learned. So these are all, I think, very important aspects, as I say, that I'm bringing from having been there on the ground, involved in the doing stage and some of the activities that we got involved in. But really, the way I'm going to just lead out of my short presentation is to acknowledge that this action, gender equality plans, involve a cycle of change, and to acknowledge that people are sometimes very reluctant, sometimes just uncomfortable about any form of change. And that's where resistance can kind of flourish, because there can be all sorts of reasons. We don't have resources, we don't have the wherewithal, there aren't enough. If we put women in leadership, their careers will be destroyed. There are all sorts of excuses. I'm so familiar with these. So what we have to do is be familiar with that, embrace change as the only constant, and say, we have to acknowledge people will have problems with aspects of what we do. There are different ways forward. There are no single ways, no silver bullets, but we can look at good practice and we can change and continually see this as a continuous process. So what we formulated from SAGE was a SAGE model for change that was a kind of active one. It wasn't steps. It's actually an interactive, again, cycle that goes on, and you can come off it, you can enter at any point, and you can get off and re-enter at any point. But it allows you to see some of those important features of successful implementation, like having the top-down driven support as well as bottom-up support. And this can be achieved through the team structures that help formulate the GEP actions and implement them. The cascading of unconscious bias, it's required all levels. And once you've done it, you have to start thinking about doing it all over again, because there's some legacy, but new people coming on stream. It has to be part of the culture. It's the way we do things here, and involving all the key actors. And these change. The leadership profile 10 years on is so different from what it was 10 years ago. We're now in a situation in Trinity, 10 years after embarking on this journey, we now have 33% of our grade A professors are now women. We've had elected the first woman provost. We have 2 vice presidents under her, both are women. We have 50-50% in university governance across genders. And we've got the implementation, Gultson, you referred to this about Athena Swan. Of our 24 schools, 14 have been awarded Athena Swan, which has only been available since 2015. And another 5 institutions are applying this year. So again, they all have their own gender equality plans under the umbrella of an institutional gender equality plan. So that's very important, how they interlink and they're driving each other. And it's part of this, if you like, the energy and momentum that we've had from being able to look at what are the supports and what are the constraints inside and outside the organization, using benchmarks like the SHE figures, like best practice targets from other institutions. And also when we get somewhere and we do something well, being able to communicate success. Because in our early days of Integer, we wanted to hear from the universities about what they had done and what they'd achieved and how they went about it. So I think increasingly now we're moving, as Mina said, towards a kind of community of good practice that can be shared, that can be accessed, and is going to be very important in taking the whole agenda forward into Horizon Europe. So I hope that this has been in some way helpful. The slides are there if you feel like using or adapting the wheel or the change model. But I think they give some grounding for how it looks at the coal face within the university or research institution setting, and takes it from things we ought to have, like policy formulation, etc., into the actual actions that can bear fruit. And you can then look at, do we meet our target and how are we doing? So I'll just end there, and I hope I haven't run out through my time, and say thank you very much. And I'm happy to share and answer any questions. And I'll hand over to Fanny, who I think is coming next. But thank you.
Well,
Stop
thank
sharing.
you so much. Thank you so much, Aileen. And I think Ireland is setting a very, very interesting role model for all Europe. Although the scale of the country is small, but it's a very, very well established system you have in place at the moment. Especially, I'm deeply impressed by the higher education authorities for implementing to increase the new project to increase the women professors in the fields where women are rare. So it's very, very impressive. I have happened to be a part of that program, so I am deeply impressed.
Fanny, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. So now, dear Fanny, are you ready? Floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I just shared my PowerPoint on screen, and I'm very envious of Europe and envious of Ireland when you have all these policies, infrastructure, and governance in place. And I'd like to talk about the state of women leadership in higher education beyond Europe, especially in Asia, where we don't have such systemic infrastructure. In 2020, I wrote an article in the special issue of the International Brief on Higher Education, published by the American Council of Education, where I summarized the state of it could be called a dire state of women leadership in higher education across the world. So if you note, even now, as you said earlier, even in the Anglo-based higher education institutions, the percentage of women university presidents only reaches as high as 30%. Whereas if you look at the rest of Asia, China, Latin America, or Pacific Rim, well, we are far from it. Many of them don't even have one women president in the university system. In Asia, women leaders in higher education are disproportionately likely to lead smaller colleges or women universities, even if they make it to be a university president. Whereas the top national or public universities at the highest ranks are not represented by any women leaders. And you know how in these emerging economies in Asia, for example, ranking and international league tables are so such a superstition in a way, and they get very focused on these KPIs. Well, the gender gap in academia is not confined to the top level. And there is a leaking pipeline that shows decreasing proportion of women at the senior professoriate level. International research has shown detriments for women in tenure rates and pay and in publication rates. And these detriments are heightened by the internationalization and commodification of universities, emphasizing KPIs, ranking, and H-index. And of course, we've been talking about the COVID pandemic and working from home restrictions have exacerbated women's handicap, which will affect the gender trend in the coming decades. Well, talking about trends, if we look at the trends over the year, it is more revealing about the inertia to change. Take an example of the gender gap at my university, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, over the past 15 years. Even though I have been one of the lonely voices in trying to push for greater gender equality at my university, and even though I was the first vice president at that female vice president at our university, if we look at the different trends of women's proportion in the various ranks over the years, we don't really see that much change, except for, say, the mid-rank tenured professors. For the very top senior professors, what you call the grade A professors, they remain pretty much the same over the past 15 years at the low teens. And so we can see that women haven't advanced that much, despite what we have been doing over the years. And these statistics are very important in highlighting the problem, so that the senior administration won't be complacent and say, oh, look, what's the problem? We have more female students in universities now. And they don't look at the disaggregated data and look at the different levels of student enrollment, especially at the more senior doctorate programs, and also in the STEM area programs. There are many different problems and gaps, and so if we look at some of the common barriers to women leadership in the strive for women in the strive for leadership positions, we can see their personal challenges. And Eileen in her wheel showed the personal challenges in terms of work-family interface. And for women faculty, oftentimes, first of all, we see more unmarried women faculty members than married women faculty members. And of course, there are more unmarried women than unmarried men among the faculty. For those who are married, the synchronization of marriage and childbirth and life cycle actually conflicts with the 10-year clock. Oftentimes, it's about the same time that they face tenure when they are starting to have their own children. And they often face hard choices. Socialized by the traditional concept of femininity and lacking female role models, women have less inspiration, less aspiration, and less self-efficacy to rise to the top. But we should not put the onus on women themselves as if they are the source of the problem. Structural barriers impose challenges even for those who are ready to step up. Cultural and social norms prescribe specific gender roles that put women in their place. Higher education institutions, ironically, purport to advance frontiers of knowledge, yet sexism and patriarchal biases prevail. There is a common perception that leadership and femininity are not congruent in this part of the world. Even without explicit discrimination, implicit bias would restrict women's opportunities. The culture of gender is a dominant theme that is still resistant to change in higher education. Some of these structural barriers are entrenched in the institutional system. Universities claim themselves to be equal opportunities employers, and their policies are gender neutral. However, allocation of workload is often based on gender stereotypes, with women assigned more to student care and teaching responsibilities, which are given less weight in promotion, whereas men are assigned more to research and equipment tasks. With males dominating the leadership and decision-making committees, women's special needs are not being recognized. The Old Boys Network leaves women out of the radar screen for advancement. Gender-blind policies actually disadvantage women in an environment designed by and for men. So I talk about the dire state, and I wish we have the system and the structure of Horizon EU or the Sage Wheel and all those that can help us to put the infrastructure in place. But as Eileen talked about, the core of the wheel is the gender disaggregated data. The gender statistics should become a mainstay in annual reports of all units. And we should have gender parity as an evaluation indicator of performance of these units. And we need to have engagement at all levels to change the norms, even though we may have top level leadership endorsement. But if it doesn't prevail down the ladder, it won't be implemented with wholehearted dedication. At the same time, we need to identify the local challenges. We cannot just copy from best practices. We have to adapt it to the local situation. Otherwise, there would be the backlash. We often hear people say, oh, these gender equality policies are Western imports. We in Asia are different. Or no, these are very common backlash and resistance. So in the past, when I've been promoting gender equality, I often find it more useful not to emphasize on the rights aspect, but on the needs aspect. How we address the needs of our colleagues, the needs of our different groups of female colleagues. And then how can we help them to improve and help the system to improve? It is probably more, we get more receptivity that way. And at the same time, as we are trying to improve ourselves, we also need feedback on the implementation of these suggestions. So I'm really envious of what you have in Europe, but I think the best practices, the good practices are very useful tools so as to borrow from. Thank you. Gilson, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Fine. Thank you very much for this very informative presentation. We have learned a lot about the Asian cases and Asian worries and problems. And yes, at European level, there are impressive developments, but not enough really. I'm sure that Mina is not very satisfied with the developments in the recent she figures. And situation is not very bright, but we should be encouraging ourselves and our young generations in order to go further and to create much better world for our young generations.